Today, owning, buying, selling, or transferring a bump stock is illegal at the federal level. President Trump directed the Justice Department to propose changes that would ban bump stocks after they were used in the 2017 concert massacre in Las Vegas. Let me just remind you what bump stocks are. First of all, take a look at what a bump stock is. It's a device that fits onto a semi-automatic weapon, which allows the shooter to increase the number of rounds fired per minute. The outcome is similar to using a fully automatic weapon. Why do people use them? Well, semi-automatic rifles are legal under federal law. They fire one bullet each time the trigger is pulled. But fully automatic rifles are illegal without a special permit. Think of a machine gun that fires rounds continuously as long as the trigger is held down. People who want weapons capable of fully automatic fire cannot legally modify the components of their gun. But until now, they could legally buy accessories like bump stocks. The accessory frees the weapon to slide back and forth quickly between the shooter's shoulder and trigger finger, causing it to fire over and over. So the shooter just needs to hold a finger on the trigger and hold the stock very close to their shoulder tightly, and the weapon will continuously fire. In December, Justice Department officials issued the ban, giving owners a 90-day period to turn in their bump stocks, to turn them over to federal authorities or crush them. That leads to today, where now a violation of the federal ban comes with a $250,000 fine on top of a possible 10-year prison term. Joining me now, founder of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, Shannon Watts. Shannon, this doesn't, given the description I just offered, this doesn't seem like it was hard to arrive at. And in the days after Las Vegas, most people, some people had never heard of bump stocks, and most people who then first learned about them felt that something should be done about them, including the president. But within moments, the National Rifle Association had somehow turned this into a Second Amendment conversation.
Yes, that's right, and that's why you're not hearing the NRA talk about it. First, they tried to get the Congress to not pay attention to this, and then they tried to water down the ruling by the ATF. This is a huge loss for the gun lobby, and it's why they're being silent. But it is a first step, and it's a very important step by the Trump administration, but we need to do more. And that's, in fact, why Moms Demand Action volunteers are at a Senate hearing today for a red flag bill. It's why the House has passed a background checks bill. There's huge momentum in this country around gun safety, but we are waiting for lawmakers to act.
Courts. Earlier today, Chief Justice John Roberts denied an emergency request by gun owners to temporarily block the Trump administration's ban on bump stocks, which took effect at midnight. Another request is still pending in front of Justice Sotomayor. Are you surprised that the Supreme Court ruled this way, or is it a sign of movement from the Supreme Court about becoming more open to discussing gun legislation?
Look, we believe this will be the land of the law. As of today, the law of the land. As of today, it is the law. People have to turn in their bump stocks or get rid of them. And this ruling by the Supreme Court shows exactly where they have been on this issue, which is that you have the right, we have the right to regulate gun ownership. With responsibilities goes gun laws. And so that's what we're focused on. That's what the Supreme Court has said. And we're so glad that this is the law of the land as of today, but we also need Congress to do more. We need them to pass red flag laws and background checks.
I want to remind everybody about what the NRA said after the Las Vegas shooting. In part, they said banning guns from law-abiding Americans based on the criminal act of a madman will do nothing to prevent future attacks. This is a fact that has been proven time and again in countries across the world. In this case, Shannon, not having access to a bump stock would actually turn what happened into Las Vegas into something else. He would not have been able to fire with the speed that he was able to because he used a bump stock.
That's right. That's how this man was able to kill 58 people and injure hundreds more over 1,100 feet away from the 32nd floor of a hotel room. And you have to remember also, though, that gun manufacturers have something called a Trump slump. There's $100 million loss of sales and accessories of guns since the election of Donald Trump. And so they'll do anything they can to make up that loss. And that includes selling accessories that are dangerous and making guns easily available to dangerous people.
Are you ever in conversation with the NRA? Because there are moments where there are a lot of, most gun owners in America are law-abiding, respectful, and don't mind certain restrictions going into place that would make their ability to own a gun safer and not have them associated with these sort of things. Do you ever get into conversations with the NRA? Do they engage with you?
It's such an important point because the vast majority of NRA members actually support common sense gun laws like background checks. This is about an extreme leadership of the NRA. They have become so extreme that they won't support any gun law, no matter how much data shows that it will help save lives. And so, until that leadership becomes less extreme and comes to the middle or has new leadership, we really have to rely on our members of Congress to change the laws in this country that will make it safer for everyone, including 90% of their constituents who want stronger gun laws.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.